Boop, 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 boop. Night
Beep,
school.
beep, 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 beep. Night school.
Night school?
Night school.
So I've read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis twice at different times in my life. Over the past couple weeks, I listened to the audiobook while I was working like 4 times. And I've listened to it and read it so many times now that I have a lot of criticisms of it. And so I want to clarify before we start the episode that I didn't have any criticisms after reading it twice. It's such a brilliant and insightful book and such a nice and gentle and intelligent and simple, concise summary of Christian belief. It's so good. But once you've read something and listened to it so many times, you start picking up all these things where you're like, wait, I don't quite agree with this or that. And so
Totally.
I'm going to pick on this book like more than is fair if you've read it once or twice, you know.
Sure.
And I strongly recommend this book for Christians, non-Christians, whoever. It's one of the most popular, for a reason, summaries of basic Christian belief ever written. So it's worth the read.
Sweet.
What he was aiming to do was just offer the most basic summary of Christian belief, and it's a hard task because it's such a controversial subject. There's such diverse views on what Jesus meant.
Yeah.
And then what Christianity is in relation to Jesus, and it's a hell of a can of worms.
Right.
This was filmed in and I meant to look this up. Hey, Evan, you want to look up when the radio talks that became Mere Christianity were originally recorded? Because this was originally done on the radio. It was 3 parts. One part on the case for Christianity, as in arguing why Christianity is rational. Christian behavior, as in explaining Christian morality. And beyond personality, so those 3, beyond personality is like C.S. Lewis' perspective on losing the self, and not becoming a prideful, egotistical being anymore, but just being somebody who's surrendered to God and just lives naturally in that way.
Okay.
So those 3 radio talks became the book. They were released over kind of the years 1941 to 1944. 1941 to 1944.
Okay.
So that would be during World War II.
Yeah.
And it was a time when the United States was generally united around Judeo-Christian ideas, especially because it was in a time of war and
Sure.
people kind of get closer to the fire,
Totally.
when there's dogs around.
Yeah, you're gonna
Or
you're gonna
not
cling to
dogs, but like
religion
lions
more.
around. Like when there's a predator, people get closer to the warmth, and they get
Totally.
closer to their beliefs. And
Yeah.
so the book is like, one of my criticisms of the book is that he kind of flip-flops between making logical arguments for Christianity and saying, like, just believe in Christianity even if it doesn't quite make sense for this or that reason. And it's a little all over the place in, like, how he chooses to make his arguments. And one of the things is, like, at some parts, he relies strictly on intuition. Like, he's like, doesn't it just kind of seem like there's a universal
Right.
moral law
Yeah.
that governs all things? And
Which can be convincing.
and it does appeal to the intuition of the audience, but
Yeah.
he takes that to mean that those ideas are necessarily universally true because they appeal to the intuition. But when you're appealing to the intuitions of people who exist in a Judeo-Christian matrix by giving them Judeo-Christian ideas, it's kind of cheating. Like if you went over to China and said, isn't this just intuitively true? They'd be like, no, what do you mean? There's not a governing force over everything with intentions and preferences. Like, no, that's not the way we tend to think about it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't transcend culture is all I'm saying.
Yeah. I think we've talked about this before. I get annoyed when people say, like, come on, it's just common sense. When they're talking about something and they say, like, do we really need to talk about this? This is just common sense. This is how it is. And I think sometimes that, like, something that is common sense isn't necessarily true. Like, it could be that your knee-jerk common sense reaction is going to be like, well, obviously you would want to do it this way. But if you really sat down and thought about it more deeply, you're going to realize that, like, oh, it seems that way on the surface. But if you think about it more, then that's not totally the case.
And that's a perfect segue into another area where C.S. Lewis flip-flops in the ways that he constructs his arguments, is that he says about Christianity that it has just that peculiarity of things that are true. Like when you, and what he means is that it's counterintuitive. So he's saying, like, you found out what a black hole is, or you find out that we're not the center of the Milky Way and we're revolving around something and we're just the fourth one of 9 or however many, and you figure out the way shit works and you're like, that's not really the way I would have expected it would work. He says that because true complex ideas tend to have that peculiarity to them, that validates Christianity, because the idea that there is a universal mind that manifested as a human being to show us what God really is, and that we have to devote ourselves to that person to unite with being. It's all just peculiar enough and just strange enough that that it has the quality of things that turn out to be true. But then he says later, or actually earlier, doesn't it seem intuitively true that there's a universal moral law, and therefore that's true? So sometimes he says it's true because it's counterintuitive, and sometimes he says it's true because it's intuitive.
Right.
And he does that when it benefits his argument. And something that's interesting, this is a really harsh criticism, but I think that there's something to it, and it's really presumptuous of me to criticize C.S. Lewis because he was so brilliant in multiple areas. And as a man of literature and a man of narrative and a man of philosophy, totally brilliant. And so it's kind of like, who the hell are you to even criticize this book? But this stands out to me so much, like I can't help but point it out.
Sure.
So he makes the argument in the book that pride is the worst sin, and he makes arguments like pride is the only sin that doesn't allow for the existence of brotherhood. Like, even if we were drunk or we were lustful, like if we were going out doing drugs, or we were going out just to get laid, or doing things that were strictly for the service of self, that were lustful, that were greedy, that were gluttonous, we could still be homies while we do it and have fun together doing it. And pride isn't that way, because it interferes with the friendship, because I just want to be the better man than you, and vice versa.
Right, because we'd both be putting ourselves above each other.
Right.
Yeah.
Rather than at least enjoying something hedonistically together. So he's saying it's worse in that respect. He says it's unique in the sense that the more of it you have, the more it bothers you and others. He says it's unique in the sense that it will make you want things that you don't even want, because you'll take, like all the rappers, I'm gonna take your bitch, I'm gonna drive a better car than you, or whatever. It's not even that you want the woman or you want the car or whatever, but just that you want to have it so that someone else doesn't.
Yeah.
Or you just want to have it so that you have more of it than the other person, whatever that object of your lust is.
Yeah, it's just about winning.
Yeah, and it's not just about yourself winning, it's also about yourself winning and another person losing. Like, I want you to lose so that I win, and I want to win so that you lose.
Yeah.
Pride has that quality about it. And it was really an insightful deep dive on the nature of pride, but I did feel that you could make that argument about any of the 7 deadly sins if you propped them up and then said it's unique in this sense, therefore it's the worst one. You could say, like, lust is the very foundation of sin because it's about wanting what you don't have, and godliness is about wanting what you do have. And if only we could eliminate this one thing that's like the worst sin, we could all be content. And if we could be content, we wouldn't need to want or desire, and we wouldn't step out of our place, and everything would align. You can make that argument for lust. Or I honestly think you could do it with any of the deadly sins. You could do a deep dive on it, describe its nature, and say this is the worst one. This is the very foundation of sin itself.
I get what you're saying.
But the Bible did say these are the 7. Like, it didn't really anoint one as the one. And so the fact that C.S. Lewis chose to make the argument that pride was the worst sin, and then made the argument that the more pride you have, the more pride bothers you, means that C.S. Lewis's worst sin is pride, not that the universal worst sin is pride.
Yeah.
And something prideful about the very foundation of this book is that he wants to argue that Christianity is the true religion as opposed to other religions being true.
Right.
But in his defense, one thing really insightful that he says about Christianity versus atheism is that as an atheist, you have to convince yourself intellectually that all religions are foolish or childish or whatever. And as a Christian, you can say there's plenty right about all the religions. I just happen to think Christianity is right where we differ. So you can be a more progressive thinker on comparative religion as a Christian than as an atheist, maybe. But then, you got brilliant atheists like Jonathan Haidt who study moral philosophy and the utility of religion and is far more open-minded than the average Christian. So I'm just saying he makes an insightful point there, not that it's true. Um, the what's insightful about the point is that he was more open-minded towards other religions as a Christian than he was when he was an atheist before. So
Yeah,
for
I
him
do
and
think
his
that's a good point.
story,
Yeah.
yeah, it's true for him. So, but he says that it's necessary that where Christianity and Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam or whoever disagree, the Christian thinks that Christianity is right. And I don't think that's necessarily true, because Christians should be trying to follow the example of Jesus. So if the idea popular in Christianity about a certain thing seems more distant from the truth that Jesus said than the Buddhist expression of that doctrine, you should side with Buddhism on that specific issue. You should say, you know
Yeah.
what, the Buddhists are closer to getting at what Jesus said here than the Christians are. So on that one point, I happen to agree with this body of thought more than this one.
Right.
If Christianity is about aligning one with Jesus. But Christians were first, the word Christian was first used in geographically in Antioch, scripturally in Acts 11. And at that point, so
Sorry, it was used. What do you mean
geographically in Antioch. I mean, as far as space goes, the first place it was used was Antioch.
Oh,
as far
okay.
as scripture goes, the first place it was used was
Gotcha.
chapter 11 of the book of Acts. Acts is the 5th book of the New Testament. The first 4 are about Jesus, and then Acts is about what everybody did after Jesus left.
Okay.
So the book
So
of Acts is not about Jesus, it's about the apostles.
Oh, so it's like the Acts of the Apostles is what the title's meant?
Acts of the Apostles is
Okay.
actually the title of the book.
Oh, okay.
Acts is just a nickname.
Oh, wow.
So a Christian was somebody who followed the teachings of the apostles. A Christian was not someone who followed the teachings of Jesus. So the definition of a Christian is someone who follows the teachings of Jesus secondhand. And so what do you call somebody who firsthand follows the teachings of Jesus?
Apostle?
Yeah, I guess you could say apostle, or I mean, the name of the original church wasn't the church of the people who are Christians. It was just, they just called it the way.
Right.
And so that gets into the vagueness of Taoism and Zen Buddhism and
Yeah.
all these other traditions that people would like to separate themselves from.
Mm-hmm.
But pride is the motivator for religious people who want to believe that their religion is correct and other religions are wrong. C.S. Lewis is
Yes.
trying to make the argument that his group is right as opposed to other groups, not the argument that we should seek the truth that Jesus spoke. If it's about Jesus, it's not about the ego of the Christian belief system.
Right.
So he doesn't he doesn't cite Jesus throughout the book. This is not a book about what Jesus said, which is interesting because you'd expect a summary of Christianity to be very much about the things that Jesus said.
Yeah.
And it's not. It's about the beliefs typically held by the group of people who call themselves Christians.
Yeah.
It's one step removed from Jesus, and I think there's pride involved in that. I
Yeah.
want my group to be right, not another
Totally.
group. I want my group to be right instead of another group. That's
Yeah.
pride.
Is it even like he wants his group to be right more than he wants the like
Jesus
literal
to
words
be
of
right.
Jesus to be right?
Yes, I would say so.
Yeah.
I would say so. And so does that mean that C.S. Lewis was a person who struggled primarily with pride? Not that he was fundamentally a prideful person. I do not think that that's the case. But was the sin that he struggled with mostly pride? Probably, because that's what stood out to him most in other people. And as he said,
Yeah.
it stands out because you have it. And so,
And he was famous. He wrote wrote really popular books.
fuck yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Narnia blew up.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so at the very beginning of the book, he says, he refers to himself as a typical member of the Church of England, not especially high nor low, not especially left nor right, and implies in the way that he words it that the Church of England is a very typical and central denomination. And then he says that,
I've never heard that term, the Church of England. Like,
yeah, I don't know what it is either.
okay.
Anglican, that's what it is?
Yeah, Anglican's like the doctrine, but they just call it the Church of England.
Okay, so Evan's saying that the body is called the Church of England and the doctrine is called Anglican. Okay, cool.
Okay.
So he said that he sent the second of the 3 essays to 4 religious people, whatever you call them, because there's different names in different denominations. Anglican, Methodist, Catholic, and I believe it was Protestant. It might have been something else. He sent it to like 4 different religious guys and was like, what do you think of this? And they were all pretty much on the same page. And he said that the people who were, those 4 different teachers who were devoted to their denominations, despite the differences within their denominations theologically, tended to agree that this book was a concise summary of Christian belief, and that he got most of the criticism from outsiders or outskirters or like non-denominationals of the Christian faith, like me criticizing him right now.
Mhm.
And so I think part of the reason for that is that, like, he's saying you can break Christians down into the denominations,
Mhm.
and then everyone else is just on the outside and they're not in any categories. But you could also break Christians into two groups: Christians who are members of the Christian establishment and Christians who are not members of the Christian establishment.
Mhm.
And so if you break it down that way, you could say, these probably think about Christianity in a way that would be more systematic, in a way that would be more conservative, that would be more rule-based, that would be more hierarchical. And then these non-denominational Christians who don't subscribe to a particular denomination
Mhm.
might be more liberal, might be less rules-based and more grace-focusing, might think about it in a more open-minded, abstract, subjective way.
Mhm.
And they might read this book and feel the way that I feel about it. Like,
Yeah.
you just want your religious body to be right.
Right.
And so he said he found it really encouraging that members of these different denominations agreed that his summary was correct. And I think he's jumping to justify his book by saying, well, all members of a Christian establishment, agree. Well, that just means that this is a summary of Christianity that appeals to members of Christian establishments.
Right.
And not all Christians feel that the best thing they can do is join an establishment. And
Although he might not even consider you or those other types of people a Christian as he literally defines it.
right, and he does define Christianity in the book and make it very clear that he doesn't define a Christian as someone who behaves like Jesus. He defines a Christian as someone who accepts these doctrines that
Okay.
the Christian churches put forward.
Okay.
And so that's
do
not
you-
the way that non-denominational Christians define Christians.
Yeah. So you
And,
think he would consider you not a Christian by his definition? Do you think that?
I agree that the basic doctrines of the Christian church are true, but probably in a different way than he does.
Right.
So I feel like I would really get into the weeds trying to talk about that, because it's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
do I think that there's a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? Yes, I think that those symbols about the structure of the universe are true.
Yeah.
Um,
But when we get this far into the weeds, it's a real semantic game, and it's hard to know whether we're all
Or
saying the same thing.
yeah.
Wait, you just used the word I want you to use, but I don't know if you thought what I thought when you said it.
right.
Yeah.
Right. Or like only through the grace that Jesus offered can a person be saved and have everlasting life and go to heaven and all that. I agree, because I believe that when Jesus spoke, the very universal mind, the very ground of being spoke. And I believe the only way to be saved is through that. And I believe Jesus spoke on behalf of that.
Mhm.
So I believe that that which Jesus spoke on behalf of is the only way to be saved, and that is available not just to Christians.
Mhm.
So
But
that
what
just
you
sounds like a
mean-
bullshit runaround
Yeah.
to a lot of members of the Christian establishment. It's not. It's me trying to be as sincerely honest as possible about what
Yeah.
I think it all means.
Yeah.
And I cannot be honest and join a denomination, because I don't believe in the denominational game for me. Like,
Mhm.
I do think that it's the fact that there are dozens, hundreds of branches of Christianity that emphasize different aspects of theology, but are still all oriented around the person of Jesus.
Yeah.
That's the way that it is. I'm under no authority to say that's right or wrong, or the way it should be or the way it shouldn't be. That's the way that it is for a reason.
Mhm.
Different aspects of it appeal to different people. Some people have a belief system, they want to join a club oriented around that belief system and hold them to it. Some people want to hold it in a more abstract, subjective way, and it's more of a knowing than a team to join. And so that's all Christianity as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
But would C.S. Lewis consider me a Christian? I feel like if we got into a conversation about it, he might feel that I was being a bit dodgy, because he's a very concrete, objective thinker.
Yeah.
Even though he was quite a visionary and artist as well, he's very irritated by people who don't fit into categories. It irritates him. He's like, get in a category so I can categorize you. It irritates him when people are outside of those.
Yeah.
And the reason I specifically say it irritates him is that he takes a few jabs at them. He's taken a jab at my kind of more vague, subjective Christian when he says that he finds it encouraging that members of all denominations agree, but the others criticize him. He's implying that they're criticizing him because it's the truth and they just want to kind of know the truth, but keep one foot in, one foot out.
Right.
So he's taken a shot, and then he takes a shot later at non-religious people who change their arguments as a discussion unfolds, and sometimes say, well, Christian doctrine is just too simple, life is more complicated than that. And then when you get more complex about Christian doctrine, they say, well, that's all too complicated. Wouldn't God make it simple? And they shift their feet and their arguing strategies as they go just to try to win.
Yeah.
Takes a shot at those kind of people, and it just sounds like he's like, I just want them to fit into a category so I can just tell them that they're wrong, but they're moving
Yeah.
around and squirming. And
Yeah.
he seems like a very categorical thinker like that. And
Very
even though he
orderly.
does the same thing, he says this is true because it's intuitive, this is true because it's counterintuitive.
Yeah.
And we all do, because we all want to be fucking right.
Yeah.
And so we change our arguments as we go. Just like when you wrestle someone or box someone, you change your stance as you go. When we
Yeah.
fight with our ideas, we change our stance as we go. We want to win the fight.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it is a big dick swinging game, but he's participating in it. Like, this book is saying, like, no, my religion's the right one.
Yeah.
So the book is not just about summarizing Christian ideas and Christian belief. Part of the book is about arguing why they're true. Part of the book is about describing what they think about behavior. And then the last part is like the last third is like a more general thing about like Christian character and Christian being and escaping egoism and pride and all of that stuff. So it's like, it's not exactly, I feel like if you were going to write a book that was just about what do Christians believe, it would just basically summarize what Jesus said. And at that point, it's like, why not just copy paste the Sermon on the Mount?
Yeah.
Like how do you, he says at the very beginning of the book, I got a few questions about this book. One of them is, what qualifies me to summarize what Christians basically or merely believe? And I mean merely, M-E-R-E-L-Y. And then he poses another question, and then he answers that second question, and then he never revisits the other one. And I'm like, wait, what? I skipped past in a minute because I'm listening on audiobook. Skip
Which
backward
question
a minute.
did he not answer?
What qualifies me to express basic Christian doctrine?
Okay.
So he says that and then asks another question and then answers the second question and then just moves on to something else. And I'm rewinding. I'm like, did he just do that? I don't know if he's being clever
It could be
and
kind
doing
of
it
a
on
joke.
purpose and just kind of saying like nothing qualifies anybody to talk about it, but
Maybe.
I'm going to take my best stab.
Yeah.
Or maybe he just felt like acknowledging the question would give him credibility, but he didn't have a way to answer it. So he just acknowledged that it was a valid question and then didn't answer it because he didn't have a good answer. But it was weird, and it is like, who are you? Like, just let Jesus say it,
Yeah.
And so when I was considering, the first time I read this book, I was in a relationship where the girl was a Christian, and I'm like, I want to understand her worldview and give it a serious look because it's the belief system so important to her. I want to get what this is all about.
Right.
Talked to Brent here at Eastlake. This is years ago though, and he gave me Mere Christianity, and I read it, and it did genuinely help me understand.
I didn't know that.
What-
I didn't know that came from Brent.
Yeah.
That's cool.
So it helped me genuinely understand what Christians meant. Like, why is it reasonable to be a Christian? It really did help me understand, empathize, and even start the process of becoming a person who considers himself a Christian or attempting to be a Christian, more accurately. So then the next time I read the book was when I had a personal encounter with Jesus. And obviously I mean an imagination thing. If you're an atheist, all I mean is that I had a daydream about Jesus that inspired me.
Okay.
And if you're a religious person, what I mean is that I had a vision of Jesus. So who cares which one it is, really?
Sure.
So, but I had a powerful experience, and I'm like, I really want to seriously look into this Jesus thing, and I read it again. That time, I don't know if it helped me, because I feel like taking someone away from the task of pursuing Jesus directly and instead redirecting them to the process of becoming a member of the group of people that call themselves Christians and aligning
Right.
with those beliefs, I think it actually distracts you
Sure.
from the way, the Christian journey.
Yeah.
I think what people should be told if they're considering being Christians, read what Jesus said.
Yeah.
Read what he said. Everybody is going to read it differently, so don't read someone else's secondhand translation of it. Read what Jesus said.
Right.
Or I can say, I personally summarized the Sermon on the Mount, his most important speech, into these 14 points. Here they are for you. What do you think of those? That's what the guy said. Can you get behind that? And just point them at the goddamn thing.
Yeah.
Instead of say like, well, let me tell you what most people who believe in him believes. Like, who cares? People are idiots. None of us know what we're talking about. All of us are a mile off of, constructing our minds after the example of Jesus. So
Yeah.
what the fuck do we know? So I think the book is like, I still strongly recommend the book because you're not going to find a more bright and simple summary of the Christian belief system as this, but I don't think it's as Christian as just reading what Jesus said.
Yeah.
So
I know that, like, I remember you years back when you first read it referred me to this book, and I started reading it, and I didn't like it. I didn't like the way C.S. Lewis was presenting some things. But since then, I remember, like, Jordan Peterson and Duncan Trussell, who's one of Rogan's friends, they both referred to, like, how crazy and good the Sermon on the Mount is. And I have read the Sermon on the Mount a couple times since then, and it is awesome. Like, everybody agrees with everything that gets said there.
Yeah.
It's really well said, everything that Jesus says.
yeah,
So that is a lot more attractive to me. It seems like than at least me a couple years ago found this less attractive than just reading the Sermon on the Mount.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I would disagree that everybody likes it, because I feel like the general audience type of everybody likes it, but there's a reason that people practice Christianity, call themselves Christian, are like card-carrying members of the club or tribe of Christianity, but don't read the Sermon on the Mount.
Sure.
Is that it does like challenge that religious structure. It is.
Yeah, you're right.
It's like if if Santa Claus just like walked into the room and the parents don't get to be the center of attention to give the presents anymore. It's like that kind of weird, it's awkward. It's just like, oh,
Yeah.
we can just read the message of Jesus. We don't need all of this. Like, what's so important about these pastors and these organizations and these 14 million Christian books a year articulating it in different ways? Like,
Yeah.
what is all this?
Yeah.
If I can read what Jesus said in 5 minutes,
Yeah.
and it's in a book that's been distributed 5 billion times. Like, it's this easy.
I
What the
agree.
fuck is all this?
Yeah.
And it's threatening to Christians that what Jesus said was so simple, so accessible, and so widely distributed.
Yeah.
So I feel like they kind of like put like under the rug a little bit, like, yeah, he said that, but
Yeah.
let's read out of Romans today. Let's read out of Genesis today. And it's just like
Yeah.
trying to complicate it to keep the customer base involved, or dependent, I should say. But I don't mean that like that Christians are doing that intentionally in an evil way. I just mean that's human nature. It's like, I want to be relevant. I want to matter. If you don't have to hear me, you can just go to the mouthpiece of God, and He'll
Yeah.
tell you, like, what's my purpose? What am I
Yeah.
going to do? Go get a job? Like, people, this is my job. This is what I do. Like, so it's threatening,
Yeah, it's interesting that Jesus's message was disruptive when he said it, and it's still in a way, because I agree, you're right, not everybody likes it, or else people would be reading it more often than they do.
Right. But non-Christians don't read it because
disruptive
they
now.
associate it with Christianity, which they don't associate themselves with. And Christians don't read it because it disrupts religious structure, and
Yeah.
they're not really encouraged to. Like,
Totally.
pastors should be saying that all the time. Like, hey, don't forget to just read what Jesus said. Like, you don't hear that at church.
Right.
Like, we did. I like Eastlake. Obviously, I'm biased for Eastlake. But today we just read a parable from Jesus and went over what it meant. And that is what I think church should be.
Yeah.
I don't feel like, I think it makes Brent really, really uncomfortable, the thought of anyone relying on a pastor to keep their faith intact, whether it's him or anyone. It's just like, oh, God, don't lean on me. Lean on
Yeah.
Jesus, please.
Yeah.
So, let's see.
Pastors should just have a bunch of like stuff that Jesus said memorized, and just like pastors should just be doing the Sermon on the Mount, just doing a cover of the Sermon on the Mount.
All the time.
Yeah, they should do it all the time.
Yeah. Well, I reworded it a little bit today, or, I
Sure.
did a deep dive on this part today and gave you a piece of evidence that it turns out to be true. What he said is evidenced by science or whatever. Like, I don't know, give some commentary on it, help it be relevant to everybody. But
Yeah.
pretty much, yeah. And it's also not all that he said. There's a lot of other useful things he said that aren't in the Sermon on the Mount. So I don't mean to just narrow in on that one part specifically, but like, if we just closed all the churches and everybody just read the Sermon on the Mount every day for a month, I feel like we'd all be
Yeah.
more of the way than all this distracting nonsense.
Yeah.
We're getting motivational speeches and whatnot
Yeah.
every Sunday, and it's just feel like we're just dancing around the point.
Sure. It's certainly not all he said, but it feels like the most concise thing if you wanted to point someone to 2 pages that encapsulates what he was saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Everybody who's considering Christianity should just go read that. And also, if you're listening to this and you're curious about checking out the Sermon on the Mount, this is kind of confusing. It's in the Bible a couple of times. So if you look up Sermon on the Mount, you might find one that's like a couple paragraphs or one that's like 10 paragraphs, because there's 4 books in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that document who Jesus was and what he said, and at least 2 or 3 of them have the Sermon on the Mount in them.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like one in Matthew and there's one in Luke, and I don't know for sure if there's one in Mark or John, but just be warned, there's different versions of it, and so don't let that confusion distract you. I think the Matthew one's the longest, so I'd
Mm-hmm.
recommend that one.
Yeah.
Read the longest one, or if you like the idea of reading the shorter one, read the fucking shorter one. Who cares? But just read the Sermon on the Mount. Just read
Yeah.
what the guy said.
I didn't know that it was in multiple books, but that's further evidence to the fact that like this was a really good summary of what he was saying, because they all felt like, or that several of them felt like it was one of
Yeah.
the most important things from his life that they wanted to talk about
Yep.
in a book that takes a half hour to read or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, for sure. So let's see. I mean, we talked about like my macro perspective on the book itself, but we can go into some of the individual things that he said that I really like.
Cool.
He had this metaphor about how getting right with God sets you right with other people, in the same way that each spoke being aligned with the center of the wheel also places them in the correct position to the other spokes.
Okay. Yeah.
So you get right
Yeah.
with God, you're right with everybody. Totally agree with that. And I've heard that in sermons too, about the nature of the horizontal and vertical parts of the cross. Is like it's about aligning yourselves in the vertical sense with God, and also about aligning yourselves in the horizontal sense with others. And I really like that imagery.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I don't think it doesn't feel like a deliberate thing, but it is an interesting idea. It is an interesting like image to use, I suppose.
well, I think it's like when the symbol of the yin and yang doesn't mean one thing in particular. It means
Sure.
it means so many things. It's this expression of dualism generally, but it also means there's a piece of one in the other and a piece of the other in the one.
Yeah.
And you could break down what the line in the middle means, what's between them, what holds them intact.
Yeah.
It's meant to be such a fundamental symbol that it can be broken down so many ways, that it's so simple yet it contains so much. And we're just not as psychoanalytic in the West, and so the cross is just like, well, that represents the place that the guy died, And I do think it is meant to be broken down as a symbol too. And like for example, there's historical fact and there's mythological fact. We say some things happened just to inform you that they happened, and we say some things happened because there's a theme expressed in the story that should guide your being.
Right.
And the cross, Jesus represents the intersection of history and mythology. We say it because it's mythologically true, and we say it because it's historically true. So the cross represents that intersection. Or you could say the horizontal and vertical thing. Or you can say, he said, bear your cross. So you can say the cross represents suffering. Just like Buddha said, the first step is accepting suffering. Like we could say, yeah, that's why our symbol is the cross. It represents voluntarily accepting suffering.
Yeah.
And that's what the cross represents to us. So, I think it's meant to be broken down and psychoanalyzed and meditated on like that. Not just like, it's not a piece of wood. It's such a simple image. Just that line and that line. It's 90-degree angles. Just this simple little symbol. What all can you get out of that?
Yeah, you can get a lot.
He said, sacrificing things to God is the equivalent of a little kid asking his dad for money so that he can buy him a present for his birthday.
That's a cute idea.
Right. So how could we not give everything to God? How could we not pray in that way? How could we not worship in that way? Expressing to God that everything that we have belongs to him or it or whatever. Like, I don't give a shit about the gender thing personally, but how can you not admit that you don't own anything that you have when you don't even understand what the source was of what you have? Like, you don't even understand where bodies and souls and brains and hair and character and personality and all of these things even came from. You can't even explain how you happened.
Right.
But we seem to want to take credit or ownership of it. It's just so absurd.
Right. We have no idea how any of this came to be, so how can we act
Right.
as though any of these things, how can we act as though we can own anything we don't even understand what it. We don't even know what
Right.
anything
Just
is.
like that little kid doesn't even know what money is, but he knows that he needs it to do a thing. And it's like, even if we got prideful, and we're like, I use my money for the service of God, it's like, oh, where'd you get it from? Like, I don't know, fucking know. Thousands of years of developing societies ended up at this point where we used a currency and we printed it out and da-da-da. I don't even know where it came from.
Yeah.
I don't even know what all went into me getting it, but I got it and I did something good with it. It's like, no
Yeah.
shit, Sherlock. You
Yeah.
better. You don't know where it came from. You better do something decent with it, you idiot. And so it's a way, that idea advocates for generosity and prevents pride.
Yeah.
And so it's real nice.
I like that idea. I like that idea of like you give up everything to God and you get what you get and you're just appreciative of what you get. And it's kind of unfortunate how that that idea that feels true and feels good can be abused by people like televangelists that are like, the more money you give, the more money you're going to get. If you're poor right now, give me all your money and you'll get back so much more. But it's
Right.
like they're just doing it to, well, I shouldn't say they're just doing it, but I can assume that because it's a very good plan, that many of them are just saying that and they're taking money
Yeah.
and they're just
Yeah.
using that sort of. That's unfortunate that kind of
Right.
thing happens. That
And
it's a
so
useful
good
tool for
teachers
that.
will always direct you at something that isn't them and they don't own. Like if you listen to Peterson. Haven't made it an episode yet,
Oh,
bitch.
I already said it 15 minutes ago.
Yep, you did. So if you listen to Peterson, he's going to tell you what Jung said, what Nietzsche said, what Solzhenitsyn said, and what Piaget said, and that's what's so valuable about him is he's not like, what you need is you need what Jordan Peterson has to say. Like you always are going to listen to him, and he's going to be like, look over there.
Yeah.
And the Buddhist
Yeah.
monk that I talked to who said, leave the monastery and go home and meditate. Or Brent who says, you want to know about Jesus, go to Jesus. I'm not your foundation. Like, that's how you know that those people, or Brent on the subject of tithing. He said, like, we need money to exist. But, like, I think it's a great thing to just give your money to something good. Give a portion of your money to something good, whether that means giving it to Eastlake or giving it to charity or whatever. This is why it's a good practice. I want this for you, not I want this from you.
Yeah.
And good teachers will always have that. And there's always a red flag when you ask someone for help, and they're like, you know what you need? You need what I got. Just like,
Yeah.
probably don't, Oh, this is a nice idea. Creatures were born with desires because the things that satisfy those desires exist. If we desire things this world cannot offer, perhaps we were born for another world.
If we desire things that this world cannot offer, perhaps we. So is he saying like if we desire God, then probably we're not from this world and we're from a world where God is more evidently present?
Yes, I think, he's implying that we crave a world more peaceful and glorious than this one because we were made for it. And we are in a place that is beneath what we need. And so
Yeah.
he's arguing that heaven actually exists, I think. But as a general philosophy, I like it. And also a side, really, I don't need to mention this. This is totally radical and ridiculous, but I think it's totally possible that we're like beings from another planet and our DNA was somehow transplanted to this planet and that we're not originally from here in the biological evolutionary sense.
Okay.
Like, I don't think we necessarily would trace all of our evolution back to just development on Earth.
Yeah.
And I don't really understand why that's just assumed, like that's just taken for granted as a given in evolutionary biology. Like, when we know how much more is out there, how do we know we're from here?
Yeah, I
And
guess
so,
just because that's still kind of a taboo topic to say that like maybe aliens put us here.
I don't even necessarily think that. Like, maybe we're from a meteor that had a little bit
Okay.
of living matter on it and it
Yeah.
landed here and we developed out of that.
Okay.
Or, maybe we were a science experiment. But just, so I say that to say, the sun burns us. So are we for here? Or is there something else going on? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and I'm sure that there's a great argument as to why the sun burns us and we evolved in a different area and now we're in this area and da-da-da. And so I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but I didn't want to go on this tangent because it's so weird.
That's fine.
But,
Yeah.
But
Fine with me.
but I really like the idea that that because we crave things that we don't find around us, we're not just made for this dimension. Like there's an aspect of our consciousness that's aware of something else
Yeah.
that's not, you
None
know,
of us are, well, not none of us, but few of us are satisfied on earth.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that's fascinating on
Yeah.
so many levels, not just for religious reasons, but it's just fascinating. But just like a kid turns 18 and they hate their house, they just fucking can't stand their house anymore. It is because they were made to leave the house. And so
Yeah.
you could take that approach too. Maybe we were sick of Earth because we were made to evolve out of Earth. Even if we are evolutionarily from here, maybe we are meant to go land on Mars and then take the next stepping stone from there and move out into the cosmos and, leave home.
Yeah.
So maybe that's why we crave something more. But I do think it's really encouraging to tell people that it's okay that they don't feel like their needs are met on Earth, because I feel like that makes so many people feel so crazy, or maybe even makes them detach from Earth because they're just like, this isn't what I want. This isn't what I need. I need more.
Yeah.
Whether it's in their imagination and they need to go satisfy it there.
Yeah.
People have bigger aspirations than what we see around us.
I suspect that existence is like that a part of it is like that we are always unsatisfied with the current conditions because we're always moving forward through some kind of thing, through some kind of process. I mean, I'm speaking as though we exist after we die here on Earth, and that there's more things that happen to our souls after.
Mhm.
That like maybe each thing that happens is like interesting for a while and then becomes unsatisfying, and then you move on and you move on as you get unsatisfied with
Yeah.
more and higher things.
Right.
And then probably the moment you feel any sort of satisfaction, you feel boredom,
Yeah.
and then you start a new game or
Yep.
something like that.
Yeah. But I also think it's possible that enlightenment is about finding an unconditional contentment, not and no longer going through that cycle of boredom, excitement, achievement, boredom, excitement, achievement, boredom, excitement, achievement, and developing in that way. Um, but you know what it probably is like that Horus and what's his face idea, the Egyptian thing.
Mhm.
You're what's present, but you're also something watching. You're both at the same time.
Right.
Part of us should be like, I'm totally content where I'm at, and everything's good, and it always will be. But then the present part should be like, no, but I'm bored. I want to get my blue belt. I already got my green belt.
Yeah.
So it should be both, probably.
That I like that better.
That's enough of a tangent on that shit, eh? His comments on marriage didn't age super well. He says that men should be the head of a marriage because someone needs to be the tiebreaker on decisions if there's just a complete disagreement. So it kind of might as well be the man in an arbitrary way. And that he says like, well, women, wouldn't you say that your main complaint about your husband is that he's not aggressive enough in disagreements with others, that he's a bit of a pushover? And it sounds like he has some kind of weird thing, where he's like,
Yes.
isn't that what you don't like about us? But he was never married, but he wrote a decent amount about marriage, which is interesting because there's a lot of directions you can go with describing Christian morality and behavior, but maybe he just felt called to focus on marriage.
Yeah, that is interesting.
It's kind of interesting. Yeah, it's kind of weird.
Yeah.
It's like, what's going on in your head, C.S. Lewis?
Yeah, like what crossed my mind is that it's like, women, don't you just hate how your husband's a beta male cuck?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
but
that's
he's
pretty
not-
much what he's saying, and I don't think that that's most women main. Like, I feel like their main complaint, like, he doesn't listen, or like,
Maybe that's what
He doesn't.
Maybe that's what it was though at that time,
right, maybe,
because gender roles aren't the same as they were in 1944,
right,
and so maybe that was kind of more where we were at then. But now it's probably the other way. It's probably that like men are, I don't know, like too masculine. That it's pushing in the feminine direction now is what the preference is. That he would
Mhm.
be more sensitive and that he would listen better.
I
Maybe.
feel like if I do feel like there's a truth to that Christian idea that the man is the head of the relationship, that is just like understood in totally the wrong way, because it's like, okay, the man is the leader. Like, how do you even, there's this global argument going on right now as to what leadership means. Every fucking leadership training that you attend is like, rethink leadership. It's not about being in charge. It's about taking initiative, or it's about service, or it's about how you benefit others, or it's like everybody's redefining leadership right now. It's exhausting.
Sure.
And so there's an argument going on about it, which is cool. We're going to come to some new conclusion about what leadership means. But it seems like the Christian idea of marriage, C.S. Lewis says this too, is that you become a single organism. You're a half female, half male organism that is conjoined in all areas and domains of your life. And so if you think about the brain and the fact that there's like an objective and mathematical side, and there's a subjective and religious and mythological side, there's an information-oriented side that sees the world as a place of things, and there's an action-oriented aspect of the brain that sees the world as a place to make choices, and there's those two different sides to it. You could say that the subjective side is subservient to the objective side because chaos is subservient to order, or change is subservient to structure. Like, you can make that argument. And I do feel like part of the problem with liberals and conservatives understanding like marriage dynamics is liberals consider the typical unit of human to be individual, and conservatives consider the typical unit of human to be family.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if you think that in the liberal perspective, you say one unit of person is one individual person, right? So there's a woman and there's a man and there's a kid and there's a kid, and they're all individual people and they're separate. That's more how liberals think about people, and conservatives think about it more as like the family is the unit. So if a conservative says the man is the leader, they're more just saying like the man does this part, the woman does this part, and it's a team and they're one thing. Whereas liberals are saying like, well, they're separate things, so one can't rule over the other. And it's just a different way of thinking about like, is one individual the organism, or is a family the organism, or is a society the organism, or is a planet the organism?
Yeah.
What do you consider a unit of people? And so like when Jonathan Haidt, who was raised liberal and decided to study moral psychology, went off to India and lived with conservative families, he saw that the family they were all dignified and they were all unified, but the man did do this and the woman did do that, and they had different roles, but they were part of the same thing. Like the art half of your brain doesn't feel like it's being ripped off because it's told when to start making art and when to stop making art by the concrete part of your brain, because they're one thing.
Right.
And so the Christian, I should say conservative wife doesn't feel insulted by being under the leadership of her husband because they're one thing, and that's your part and that's your part. So I feel like that fundamental thing like gets at those disagreements about what are you saying, men are in charge of women? It's like, no, we're not even saying they're separate. We're just saying they're one thing, and masculinity has a function and femininity has a function.
Yeah, or that personality traits that are better for decision making or leadership tend to manifest in men, and so in most cases that's going to be who's going to be more in charge, although not in all.
Yeah, and then how do you define in charge? The person who takes initiative, the person who makes decisions, the person who accepts responsibility for the errors, the person who's responsible for providing the income. Like, how do you even define leadership?
Yeah,
that depends on a lot of things too. And then
because
if the man is the one who goes to work and makes money and builds the fucking fire and builds the cabin, and then the woman is the one who raises the kids and cleans the house and prepares the food, then to say that the woman isn't as valued as the man is to say that the things that women do aren't as valuable as the thing our men do.
Right.
And so is the problem that women do this and men do this, or is the problem that some people decided that what men do is more valuable than what women do, and that therefore they should all do the same things? You know what I'm saying?
I do. Yeah.
So there's almost something kind of woman hating about feminism that's like the things that women typically do aren't as valuable as the things men typically do, so we should make everyone the same.
Right.
Instead of saying things that women do are just as valuable as the things that men do.
Yeah.
Like raising kids and raising a family is not less valuable than making money.
Yeah, it seems like money is definitely a big part of this. That like money's gotten mixed up in it to the point where it's like, well, clearly what the man does is more important because he makes the money, and money is power. I guess power is a part of it too, viewing it as like who has more power.
Yeah.
In this.
Yeah. So if by power you mean money, and you believe that life is fundamentally a power game,
right,
and that people should fundamentally tie in the power game,
right,
then yeah, women are really getting fucked over.
Right.
But it's just not how everybody thinks about the unit of a family, or masculinity and femininity, or choice, or the value of different roles, and it's just so.
Yeah.
But he didn't have to talk about it in this way of like breaking down all the terms, because it was so generally assumed even if you weren't explicitly Christian, you were implicitly Christian if you were in America.
Right.
And so it was just generally assumed, like, the man's this role, the woman's this role. And so he didn't have to argue it much. He's just saying, like, well, the man's in charge, and then you can just move on.
Right.
And so it's
You'd
like,
have to write it a little different now.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'd have to have that. You'd have to have evidence ready, stats ready.
Yeah.
You got to be ready for an argument.
A lot more nuanced.
Yeah, and you got to be really, really considerate and careful. And so,
Yeah.
and then, like, on the subject of homosexuality, he was defining what perversion was, and he used homosexuality as like an obvious example. And so it's like, well, you'd have to have that conversation real differently today.
Yeah.
I mean, you could if you wanted to talk to 2% or 30% or whatever of the country as opposed to the whole thing. But
Yeah.
it's like, that messaging wouldn't work like that
Yeah.
anymore. If you want to make the argument that you think homosexuality is a sin, you're going to have to start with, like, how do you define sin? How should people who sin be treated by people who call themselves Christians?
That
You
is
got to start
important,
like
yeah.
100 steps back
Yeah.
if you want to try to make the point that you think homosexuality is a sin. You're not just going to be like, perverted is like gay. It's like, yeah, different times.
So was that pretty much just the definition of perversion, or how did he define it otherwise?
No, he was saying that he was arguing against dualism by saying that evil can only exist as a perversion of good, and then defining perversion as something being used in a way that it wasn't intended to. And then he's like,
Okay.
like being gay.
Right.
So, but his arguments about dualism are funny too, because he uses like dualism at some points. Like he's like, well, pride bothers you more in others because it's reflected more in you. Obviously, reality has this sort of two-sided reflective nature. And then later he's like, dualism is wrong, Christianity's right, because good and evil are not equal forces. Evil is a perversion of good. Good is the fundamental force. Evil exists underneath it. Good rules over evil. But then...
When you say dualism, like, what is that?
Well, he's defining dualism as the belief that the universe is fundamentally half good, half evil, as opposed to fundamentally good. And that's not a good definition of dualism.
It's not what I think of when I think of duality.
No, he's just trying to put up a straw man of another basic
Right.
theological, or maybe teleological, it would be, philosophical presupposition. Like, we Christians believe the universe is fundamentally good. Those crazy Asians over there think it's half good, half bad. It's like,
Right.
no.
No, I don't think
What
so.
are you talking about?
Mm-mm.
And so it's more the belief that there's like a beautiful, peaceful indifference that exists between the ebb and flow of good and evil, or something like that. That's
Yeah.
harder to articulate.
Or it's that, like, all things are good, even the things that are bad, if you look at it from the correct perspective, all things are good. Or that feels like more what I think of when I think of dualism.
Yes. Yeah. And so in my mind, the God of someone who subscribes to a more dualistic view is that God is something lovingly indifferent that exists beyond the dualism of good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of indifferent that you are when your kid falls and scrapes his knee, and his whole world is crashing down, but you're totally aware that he's fine, so you laugh. And you're still nice, but you laugh. Like, you're polite, but you don't care. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you skinned your knee.
Yeah.
That I think the Taoist view is more that God is so removed from dualism and the struggle of good and evil that we're all just a skinned knee, and it's fine. I think it's more like that.
Yeah, I agree.
Than like fundamentally half good, half evil. It's just like, and this is another criticism of his criticism, actually. So he brings up Freud early in the book and says, Freud's general ideas about psychoanalytic principles and curing neuroses and psychoses must be correct. I'll give him that because that's his field of specialty. But his opinions on general philosophy are false, I assume, because I have read his writing on language, a subject on which he is ignorant, and he speaks quite ignorantly on it, like a false confidence on it. So I'm just going to assume when he speaks on a subject he doesn't personally have experience in, he's speaking ignorantly, and respect what he has to say about psychoanalysis and not respect what he has to say about general philosophy, and remove those. And it's like, okay, so first issue with that is that you cannot remove somebody's psychoanalytic principles from their general philosophy.
Those are not far off.
No, that's psychoanalytic principles are so closely, all of our principles and ideas are embedded in our general philosophies. But psychoanalysis is practically a field of philosophy, you know? It's not like it's an objective science that you like. There's evidence that people who have dreams about black wolves need to deal with resentment, and we measured the resentment in their brain. You know, it's not a science like that.
Right.
It's something intuitively that you use as a tool that you feel your way through with your client. So it's philosophical in nature. So it's like you're going to separate his philosophies from his psychoanalytics. What are you talking about? But then second, he says, like, he can't speak on subjects on which he's not an expert. But then C.S. Lewis goes on to talk about moral psychology and the philosophy of science and dualism and just all sorts of random shit. And I feel like some Christians think that they're right about anything if they apply Christian ideas to them. Like,
Right.
I'll tell you a Christian perspective on dualism. I'll tell you a Christian perspective on the philosophy of science. What I mean by philosophy of science is that he says that even if you had all the information in the world, you couldn't answer questions about God.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're making a very powerful argument about philosophy of the scientific process and its limitations, which you don't know anything about. But because he's a Christian and he's giving his perspective on it, he can just kind of assume that he's right. Like people can be like,
Because
well,
he
I
has
have,
the truth.
I have the truth. I
So
have
I
the
can
Christian
put this lens
truth.
of truth over anything.
Exact lens of truth is exactly. Thank you. You just gave words to what I'm picturing in my mind. It's like they think they can just glance at something and tell you about it because they think they have this lens of truth because they belong to the right religious tribe. And it's so crazy. So he tells Freud, don't speak on subjects you don't know about. And then he speaks on all these random subjects throughout the book. And I do think that's why he justifies doing it.
Yeah.
That sort of lens of truth thing. So no, that's not a fair description of dualism. Can you imagine just like a monk like hearing C.S. Lewis describe it that way? Like, so you think the world is half good, half evil? Just like
What? What are you talking
goddamn
about?
Westerners trying to summarize the Tao in 6 words. It was pretty funny. We talked about this already. So he's talking about how we're dysfunctional with sex, and how like he says that sex is for reproduction, and so like going to the strip club is like going to a restaurant just to look at a plate of food and kind of dribble over it, which is a pretty funny comparison, I think. And you pointed out when we talked about this that there are cooking shows now where people literally do that. So it's like,
Yeah.
all right, well, now we've ruined sex and food, in case anyone was wondering. And we're fucking way off of using them. Obviously, we're way off of using sex and food correctly.
Yeah.
But he makes this weird argument where he says that that sex is more misused than food or more dangerous than food because if someone eats all the food that they want, they really can't do that much harm. But if someone had all the sex that they wanted and got a woman pregnant every time, that it would soon become a serious overpopulation issue or whatever. And it's like, well, but you only get a woman pregnant if she's ovulating like 1 or 2 days out of the month, and only maybe even in that case. And so no,
Yeah.
if you have all the sex you want, you're not going to get a girl pregnant every time you have sex. So you can't just redefine how sex works and then act like that's comparing it to food.
Right. This was also I think we talked about this that this was a pre-pill world. So like
Yeah. So yeah, when did the pill come out? The 60s?
60s.
60s, 20 years before the pill. They had condoms though.
Yeah.
Condoms have been around forever.
Yeah.
Yeah. So condoms have been around since there were sheep because they use their intestines.
God.
So, but there's so
Thought
many
of that.
so many little times like that where C.S. Lewis just makes like an argument. He's like, "Here you go, done," and moves on. I'm just like, "What? What are you talking about? That's not even." He's talking about like people's criticisms of Christianity and how people say like, "Well, how is it impressive that Jesus didn't sin if he was God?"
Mm-hmm.
And then
I remember making that argument.
Absolutely. And then C.S. Lewis says, well, maybe that's true. He did have an advantage being God, but that's no reason not to believe Christianity. But that's not why we're not saying it as a reason not to believe Christianity. We're just disagreeing with a particular point that cringy pastors make.
Yeah.
That say, isn't he amazing? Because he never sinned. We're just like, is it that amazing?
He started with a cheat code.
Yeah. We're not saying I'm not a Christian anymore. I disagree with that. We're just saying like, that's kind of silly.
Yeah.
We're not disagreeing about, he was God, and that's why he didn't sin. We're not saying he was God, that's why he didn't sin, so he wasn't God. We're just like,
Right.
just like sometimes Christians have their ego so tied up, you disagree with them on something they say about Christianity, and they think you're disagreeing with Jesus. Like, who the fuck are you?
Yeah.
You said one thing about Christianity I disagree with. You think I'm attacking a whole religion or a guy.
That's
like,
the thing, yeah.
what are you talking about?
Totally.
And then he talks about, so he's refuting pantheism. He's describing why you can't be a Christian and a pantheist. And he says that pantheist meaning that everything that exists is an atom of God or a particle of God.
Okay.
That God is the totality of everything.
Okay.
Or the universe is God, that sort of thing. So I'm a panentheist, meaning that I think that God is outside of being and that all of being added up is God. Like I think this is God, that's God, that's God, that's God.
Yeah.
But he also transcends being. So I think it's both.
So that's panentheist?
Panentheist, yeah. Monotheist
Okay.
is there's one God who transcends being. Pantheism is everything is a piece of God. And panentheism is everything is a piece of God and he transcends everything.
Okay.
So anyway, he says Jesus told the Jews that he was God. The Jews were monotheists. That means that Jesus was saying that he was the monotheistic God. And I felt like that point was so unfair because Jesus answered those questions really vaguely. He was actually pretty dodgy with the Jews. They're like, who are you? He's like, I am. No, they're like, no, who are you? Say that you're God. And he's like, I am what you say I am. I am what I am. I am all that has been. I was before John. He's like giving all these clues because he did not say, I'm Jehovah. You know what I mean? Like he didn't. And that's what C.S. Lewis is implying, that since Jesus was the chosen one of the Jews and he told the Jews that he was God, that means that he was God in the sense that the Jews understood. As though God is going to show up and say, I'm that thing you understood.
Right.
Like, no, he's going to show up and be like, you're kind of right and kind of way wrong.
I'm the thing you're trying to understand.
I'm the thing you're trying to understand. Let me
And
guide you.
Here's a riddle about me.
Here's a riddle about me. Exactly. So he's saying the Jews were right about the nature of God because Jesus appeared to the Jews and said he was God. Not a fair point. Just like so unreasonable. He was vague for a reason, and I feel like he is saying like, all right, obviously it's a huge compliment to appear to the Jews as the king of the Jews if Jesus really is being or the universal mind or the Alpha and Omega embodied in a person. Quite a compliment to come to the Jews and be recorded as the king of the Jews. And so if he really was that significant thing that I think he was as a Christian, then what he would do if he appeared to a people like that is be like, you're right, but you're totally wrong. And I'm going to be hardest on you because I'm your chosen one. And I'm going to unite you with all of these other people. Like that's what I feel like God would do. Come to the Jews and be like, you're right, there is one God. And I speak for him of that which is all being, and be all fucking confusing. And they're like, no, we can't pin this down. We can't monetize this. This is fucking vague. You know, it's like if you watch like a conservative Christian pastor talk with a Buddhist monk that or a Taoist monk or something that believes in something unspeakable or inarticulable, if that's a word, like, well, you're just dodging, you know, avoiding the thing, whatever, because what you're saying, I can't grasp. I want something I can grasp, but you worship the ungraspable. And so, and Christians worship the ungraspable too, but they like to flip-flop between God being something they can grasp and explain to you, and then when they don't understand something, saying that God is something totally ungraspable.
Right.
So C.S. Lewis does that same thing in this book where he's like, you know, the fact that there's a moral law points to the existence of God. That makes sense, right? And then later says, well, this Jesus thing is really weird, right? That means it's true, right? Jumps back and forth of like, it's true because it makes sense, and it's true because it doesn't make sense. And I actually do think both of those are true. I think God is true because he makes sense, and I think he is true because he doesn't make sense. I agree with both of those. But those are not a means of arguing as to why you picked the right religion. That those ideas don't do that. Those are not tools for that purpose. Like, it's true because it makes sense, and it's true because it doesn't make sense, therefore my religion is right. Like, those aren't connected. There's a disconnect in that train of logic. He said, you learn more about God from universal morality than from observing the universe. And he was saying that you learn more about God from Christian doctrine than you do from observing being, the way that things are. He said, you learn more, and then to, are you following me so far?
So he said, you learn more from what morality?
That was my own summary.
Okay.
He was making the argument that you learn more from studying Christian doctrines about God than you do from studying the universe.
Okay, and so what you're saying is that what he's saying is he's saying you can learn more from studying universal morality than studying the universe itself. That's your summary of his point?
That is my summary, but I feel I'm being generous in that summary actually, because he goes
Okay.
on, because he's not arguing that we go on an honest, open-minded endeavor to study universal morality. He's arguing that we should just assume that his interpretations of Christian doctrine are universal morality.
Right.
And
Okay.
and here's the way he makes his point. You learn more about a man by listening to his conversation than looking at a house he built. Totally disagree. People are totally full of shit, and the way that a man builds really says a lot about his character.
Yeah.
So it's like you're trying to use this thing to make this point. I don't know if he had never built a house before, but you know the difference when you walk into a house that someone slapped together.
Yeah.
And when you walk into, like when I'm crawling around in rafters in the attic of a house, I can tell the difference between someone who framed that house carefully and, oh shit, we got to recut this and waste a board, but let's do it anyway.
Hmm.
And people, they're like, let's get this done and get the fuck out of here.
Right.
And so it's a very, very clear difference. And so his example is wrong, and I think his point is wrong too, that he's trying to make with his wrong example. It's like,
Yeah, I think it's
studying the
wrong.
universe can tell you a whole lot about God. I think
Yeah.
more than studying Christian doctrine can, personally. But I think both are great.
Yeah, it doesn't. I think he's wrong, but I don't think the opposite is true either. It feels like those both seem totally valuable. Like he's saying, like I'm personifying it kind of as like studying God's mind or studying God's body.
Mm-hmm.
That like it seems like you could learn things from both of those things.
Yeah, why
and
would we not do both? Yeah.
And it's probably they're probably more similar than you'd think they are.
Yep. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Just like how Jung he studied religious ideas, and he studied the psyche, and he studied astrology, and he found that the same 12 common themes seemed to be present in all of them.
Wait, sorry, that was who?
Jung.
Okay.
Jung, like the 12 archetypes of the mind, and the 12 astrological symbols, and the 12 Greek gods. Like he found that there was this like 12 themes that seemed present in the mind and in history and in the cosmos and everything. It's like, huh, when I study reality at multiple levels of analysis,
Mm-hmm.
I can pluck out common threads between them that help orient us to being.
Yeah.
So that's like a way of like studying God's mind and God's body.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, why wouldn't you? Obviously, that's a good way to understand what the hell we're doing, what this whole thing is.
Totally.
So,
Yeah, I don't see it as more valuable to be studying morality than studying the universe. They both got value.
right. Yeah, man. So this is a book trying to argue that a religion is right. But fuck, he does it. He's so gentle in the way that he words a lot of things, and so articulate and so careful and so concise and insightful that like the first couple reads, I'm just like, I'm sold. You know, I'm like, this guy is like nailing the truth. And then I keep listening to it and I'm like, no, this guy is defending an ideology for his own ego. That's what's
Right.
happening. That's what's really happening here. And it's so subtle and it's so clever that it doesn't come across that way in the first couple glances.
Mm-hmm.
But still, I seriously strongly recommend this book if you're interested. It's like if you're interested in what Christians believe, read this book. Like, this will summarize it for you.
Mhm.
I just disagree that that's an expression of universal truth, and I disagree that that's a true expression of what Christianity ought to be, which is the pursuit of the individual of Jesus and what he pointed to.
Sure.
And I feel like people, like I came into this whole thing because I looked into different religions and different prophets and teachers. I'm like, you know what? The Hindus think Jesus was the guy, like not the savior in the same way as the West, but the Hindus were like, that was a realized being. And the Buddhists are like, that was an enlightened teacher. And the Muslims are like, that was a great prophet. And everybody's like, yeah, Jesus, like, yeah, Jesus. You know,
Yeah.
all these religions are like, yeah, Jesus.
Yeah.
So I'm like, that's the guy. I'm just going to go read what that guy said because
And
that's
almost all
obviously the
atheists.
fucking guy.
Almost all atheists
honestly,
are like,
yeah.
yeah, Jesus, though.
Yeah, he's cool. Yeah, I fuck
Yeah.
with Jesus. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nobody's got a problem with the guy. So there's a disconnect between the religion of Jesus and the religion of Christianity. There's a disconnect.
Mhm.
And the fact that Christianity was first used in the book of the word Christianity was first used in the book of Acts after Jesus dipped out, and it was about people who followed him, speaks volumes.
Mm-hmm. It seems like a common thread here is that in a lot of cases, like the problems that you're having with what C.S. Lewis is saying is when it feels like he's blind to his own bias and how much he's letting his own personal position in the world affect what he's saying about the universality of ethics.
Yeah.
That like he's unaware of how much that's playing in.
It bothers me. It bothers me when he commits a fallacy, and then I'm like, well, why did he commit that fallacy? Like, what caused him to overlook the fact that he wasn't being logical there? You know, like, what drove him to overlook it?
Right.
And then I started thinking about, I'm like, it is pride.
Probably.
And then I look at the
Yeah.
fact that he says the thing about pride, and I'm like, yeah, that's what's going on here. This guy is so pridefully committed to promoting his religion and his ideology that he is stumbling a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, I doubt C.S. Lewis expected this book to be perfect. You know, it's
Right.
not a perfect book. It's a fucking phenomenal book, and he's a genius. And I like his book Screw Tape Letters way more. Oh my God, Screw Tape Letters
sounds
is
cool.
so filthy. Yeah, like a young demon talking to his uncle demon about how to fuck with this Christian and keep him distant from people and stop him from joining community and all this stuff. And it's such a good, insightful look into the nature of not just evil, but sabotage specifically.
Or like the nature of what's it called when you justification. That's what I think of when you've talked about Screw Tape Letters. Is that it's like a deep analysis of like how people justify things to themselves. If you don't accept that demons exist or that there are outside influences that are trying to convince us of anything, then it sounds like it's just a really interesting look into a person justifying something within their own head.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
Like, talks about how people avoid joining a church because they just go to a church and make themselves a professional critic of churches. And they just say, well, I'm not going to any church because I criticized them all.
Mhm.
Like, well, you're always going to be able to criticize it. Just pick one. Just go to a church.
Mhm.
And so it's like, that's how, like, someone can justify isolating themselves by being overly critical of other people to the extent that they can't feel they belong with other people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, from a Christian perspective, that's like the demon of isolation, keeping you away, blah, blah, blah. From a secular perspective, that's like the subpersonality of the mind
Yeah.
that wants to preserve itself by avoiding danger
Yeah.
and therefore props up people as bad guys by being overly critical of them. But
Totally.
either way, it's a true phenomenon being expressed so well in the Screw Tape Letters. And
I gotta check that one out. That sounds interesting
yeah,
to me.
oh, it's hard, bro. That'd be a cool one to do on here.
Yeah.
I've become really interested in the fact that C.S. Lewis, Aldous Huxley, and JFK, all of which I'm a fan of, died on the same day. I'm so intrigued by that. Aldous Huxley, he wrote Brand New World, which is a
Brave New.
thank you, Brave New World about where 1984 by George Orwell was about a dystopian future where people are forced by a tyrannical, strict government to adhere to very specific rules, even going down to their ideas.
Mhm.
And Aldous Huxley said, no, that's not how it happened. The masses would be gradually coaxed into being comfortable with that sort of existence through manipulation and psychiatrics and marketing and ideological warfare and all sorts of things like that.
Mhm.
That's how it'll happen. You got to get them to be okay with it.
And that does sound more
More
plausible
accurate.
when you put it that way.
Yeah, that's more
Yeah.
plausible. Yeah, and now what? Like 50% of people are on psychiatrics, you know, to cope with being alive or
suffering
whatever.
of being.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Yeah.
just that. Yeah, we're going in a weird direction. I feel like Brave New World, really important one to read right now. Aldous Huxley also wrote The Doors of Perception about his experimentation with mescaline
Mhm.
and what it taught him about the nature of consciousness. He wrote or compiled and wrote an anthology or collection of writings from various religions called The Perennial Philosophy about the common thread between all great religions. Perennial meaning persistently ever present. So the philosophy that just is always present and always reemerges.
Mhm.
I'm reading that one right now. So he's really interesting.
Yeah.
And then JFK was, you know, a genuine politician who called out secret societies and corruption and got capped for it.
Yeah.
It's like, how is that not interesting? I've been listening to his speeches. So I'm really interested in learning about all three of those guys. And I looked up all three of their names and found a book on Amazon that's a fictional novel about a hypothetical conversation the three of them have in the bardo. What's the American word for that?
Oh, purgatory.
Purgatory.
Yeah.
That the three of them have about faith in purgatory. I'm like, interesting. So this has caught someone else's attention, how interesting it is.
Totally.
That these three great men, one of Christianity, one of psychedelics, philosophy, and comparative religion, and one of politics, all did such great things and seemed like such warriors of light, and all died on the same day.
Yeah.
The fuck?
We're Aldous Huxley and who's the other one that's not JFK?
C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis. Were their deaths fishy?
Aldous Huxley he just dropped a little bit of acid and just walked into the light. Like he died like intentionally. Like I'm not saying he overdosed on acid. I'm saying that he dropped a reasonable amount of acid and he just chose to go. And that's how he chose to die. And Alan Watts did a talk on Aldous Huxley's death and said it was an extremely intelligent form of dying, where he had cancer, but he didn't die of cancer. He just said, I'm ready, and he decided to be on acid when he went, and he dropped some acid, and he just went.
That sounds fishy to me.
Like no, but that's really common among, you can look up a shitload of Hindu gurus who have just said, today's my day. They sit on a rock and they just die.
That's true.
Some people are on a level where they just understand how to die. And Aldous Huxley wrote extensively on the nature of consciousness being that you can just walk into different modes of perception. And so I think he just walked into another life. He just left. So that's weird, but then JFK obviously was assassinated by the CIA or whatever it was. And C.S. Lewis, I believe, was a heart attack.
Kidney failure, it says.
Kidney failure was C.S. Lewis, Evan says.
Which is less shady than heart attack. My knee-jerk reaction on heart attack was, well, he was killed too. But
yeah, but I'm really interested to hear what was going on astrologically on that day that they all died.
yeah, I don't think that coincidence was brought up in Cosmos and Psyche at all.
That's
although
strange.
It's really interesting.
You would think it would be.
Yeah.
These three just totally bright, dedicated people in three totally different worlds of thought.
I don't even remember.
All died
I don't
on
think
the
I
same
recall
day.
them discussed even.
I don't remember them being brought up either.
Kind of weird.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you would think they would. If he didn't bring it up, it must not have supported the astrological worldview. There must not be something super
Yeah.
relevant, because you'd think he would know that.
True. Yeah, even if just like JFK's death is the most popular death of those three, and I
I
would
feel
assume
like
he would-
JFK did come up in Cosmos and Psyche.
maybe.
Hard to double check
They
though.
talked
We don't.
about the '60s a lot, so I'm sure he must have mentioned it.
Yeah, I bet they did. All right, I'm good on this, man. Highly recommend the book. Highly recommend following Jesus over following Christianity. And if you ever find yourself, if you ever look back and realize that you were being illogical about something, maybe it's because you were attached to something being true that isn't necessarily true.
Yeah.
I feel like C.S. Lewis is so attached to the idea of Christianity being the true religion that he's tripping over himself to try to prove it. And I don't agree, man. I just think it's a bunch of flawed people trying to figure out what this guy said meant, and they're way off, just like everybody.
And I want to say to his credit that the fact that he did mention within the book that he feels pride is the most dangerous or the worst sin may be on some level a built-in acknowledgement that I know that I have pride in me, and I know that it's possible that I do have blind spots here. So although he may have been
maybe
unaware of some of the ways in which he was making personal things about him and projecting that onto what is generally the case, it may be that he was acknowledging that in some way, that he knows
True.
he doesn't know everything.
Could be.
Yeah.
Could be a subtle warning there.
Yeah.
And then he said, if you want to go about becoming a less prideful person, the first step is to admit that you are prideful. If you don't think you are a conceited person, you are likely very conceited. So
Wow. So unless he was very conceited.
Yeah, I mean,
He could have been.
maybe he was saying there, I'm prideful, but at least I know I am. Or maybe he's saying, I'm not very prideful because I know that I am, and that means I'm not very, but I am.
Yeah.
So,
Could have
and
been either
I
way.
feel like someone who's not conceited, honestly, just wouldn't even think about it. Like, I don't think they'd have a conversation in their head. Am I conceited or not? I feel like you just wouldn't even really, little kids, that aren't conceited, they haven't developed an ego yet. They don't think like, man, I sure am a little prideful, or I sure am not very prideful. Like, that just doesn't really enter their awareness.
Right. It probably wouldn't cross your mind if you genuinely were not prideful at all.
Yeah, I think you just wouldn't even worry about that sort of thing. Like, am I prideful or not?
Right.
Because the question itself is self-indulgent. I
Yeah.
had a teacher, a pastor named Pete, who said, self-reflection is the cigarette break of the Christian walk. And I do think there's something really self-indulgent and cringy about taking the time to reflect on yourself. It's the same as looking in the mirror for a while and kind of doing your makeup. You can reflect on your character and kind of, oh, my chin's a little fat. I'm a little selfish. I'm a little greedy. I'm a little lustful, but I guess I'm okay overall, and just care so much about your character.
Mm-hmm.
Just kind of like, maybe just stop.
Yeah.
Maybe just focus on God instead of focusing on whether or not you consider yourself to be of decent character or not.
Yeah.
Who the hell are you to know to judge yourself anyway? Might as well just keep your mind focused on God. Probably be the quickest way to become more like Him.
Right. We can't be a totally objective judge while we're in the middle of the game.
No way.
Yeah.
No way. No way. Probably just win the game by becoming more like the game designer. So I don't agree with
I
this.
like that.
I don't agree with his point that someone who it doesn't think that they're conceited is actually very conceited. I don't think that's necessarily true. It's like, I personally think I don't know, I both think I am and think I'm not, but I think the fact that I would even stop to ponder it is conceited.
Yeah.
It's
That
like,
there's
why the
some in
hell am
you,
I going to
of course.
sit around wondering if I'm prideful enough or not?
Yeah.
It's just like, you have better things to do than wonder whether or not you're prideful. Like,
Right.
go do something good for somebody.
Totally.
So, night school.
Night school.